Hi everyone, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel. It's been almost a month since I've posted. Things have been busy, I'm moving soon, but I wanted to make sure I was here to film my ranking of all the horror books I've read in the last year, because it's one of those things that I've done every year since I've made this channel, and I didn't want to stop now. This sort of stems back to when Brief from Luck Petition started Blackathon, was Blackathon, and she had the Skull Awakening book tag. It has evolved every year as I decide to do it slightly different. But this year, I'm gonna actually do it a new way entirely, which really centers on my way of thinking almost numerically. I have a two-tier system that I'm gonna be working on, where I have basically like an XY axis. You have love, you have hate, and you have horrifying, and you have bland. Love and hate is basically my enjoyment overall. Horrifying and bland is really just a question of how well I think it manages to use the many different realms of horror. Horrifying is meant to be a broad term, where horrifying doesn't have to mean it's scary. Rather, how well is it able to lean into any type of horror-related genre, whether it be setting a gothic tone and things like that. That's really what I want to know. How well it's able to, I think, fit itself within the genre, as opposed to a story that touches on things that are commonly associated with horror while not really ever evoking any of those feelings that I associate with horror, whether that be, a gothic sense, an ominous sense, or a truly terrifying sense. With that in mind, let's get into it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put a little dot every time we get to a different cover. We're going to start with My Soul to Take by Tana Reeve II. This was the last book in her African Immortal series. Ultimately, I was less disappointed with this than I thought it would be, which is to say I enjoyed it and I was surprised. Overall, I find the horror to be more urban fantasy than it is like really horror, in my opinion. It deals with themes similar to, I think, a lot of what T.V. Butler's works, with to do with power and privilege. I think what I loved about this was that even though this series is very rich, or rather very much deep in the Christian mythology, I think it really subverted a lot of people's expectations when it comes to Christian fiction and what, is a happy ending. And I really liked it for that. So I'm gonna give it a solid enjoyment with a less than ideal level of horror, but still in the horror genre. A Light Most Hateful, which I was telling a review for. This is Hailey Piper, a new horror writer to me, or at the time she was, and I absolutely adored this. Hailey Piper is herself trans, and there's a lot of, I think, gender queerness in the story. It looks at friendship, identity, and I guess what defines our identity and how we become, and what makes us ourselves, like what makes us unique. Again, this is, I guess it's more horror, I think, than Tana Reeve II, but it still is dark fantasy, almost Lovecraftian. I would say I actually definitely enjoyed it more. Honestly, now I think about it, maybe I should have put Tana Reeve II lower, but I'm not going to undo this. I would give this a decent horrifying, and honestly, I really enjoyed this. I mean, one of the higher books probably in this list. I Say Crosby, All Those Sinners Bleed. This was a thriller mystery. Unfortunately, I forgot a lot about this, but I do remember the tone. The tone was excellent, meaning it definitely one of the highest of the three so far in terms of in the horror ranking. Even though it is more mystery thriller, I think it definitely sets the tone that I associate with horror very effectively. As far as enjoyment, I thought it was a solid book, if not quite as much as Light Most Hateful. That's really just more personal than anything. I know as I go through this, I'm probably gonna wish I could change edits. That's the problem with this approach of trying to do a graph, is that logistically it'd be a hassle to try and redo things. Now to this year, where I didn't read horror until Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. And this one I heard amazing things about. I did enjoy this. I would probably put my love of it on par with the African Immortal series. I thought it was solid in the horror, even though I think it is more explicitly horror than the other two books. My personal feeling of the horror, how well I felt like it was effective at what it was trying to be, which was to say unnerving and disturbing, is probably maybe on par with The Light So Hateful, maybe a little bit more than that. So I'd probably give it, I'm gonna do that. Less, I think it's, I don't know. Womb City, this is February, horror, dystopian, and sci-fi. I felt like this was a solid horror book. I had problems with it, which I have a full standalone review for, but as a horror book, I thought it was really effective. And honestly, it was just a really enjoyable read. But again, I had problems with it. I think my review in the moment might have been a bit better than this, but I'm gonna give it probably on par with All the Sinners Bleed for horror, with a little bit less love Actually, no, that's too high. I'm really being very biased. I gotta think about love and hate in terms of ratings, which I'm not doing. So this is all relative, obviously. The Good House of Tanner Reeve 2. This one, oh my god, I do love this. One of my favorite books of all time. I reread this one, and honestly, I think the horror is some of the best. The more I think about it, I'm gonna put this like I really love it. And I think it's really effective horror. I think Tanner Reeve 2 pulls on some of the more effective parts of Stephen King in terms of the ability to set the tone, but also to really evoke a visceral feeling, both in terms of the supernatural, but also human horror here. The Ecstatic by Victor Laval. This is going to be against below the love-hate line. I did not love this. The horror is more disturbing, and so I would actually say it's decent in that realm, but it's, I don't know, it's more the fact that it was very surreal, and my ability to follow the story was not great, hence me not loving it. So I actually give it probably a decent, lower of the horrifying, but not too bad. I hope y'all can see when you're watching this how obvious it will be when I place the black. The more black thoughts I place, probably the more difficult it is for you. I'm gonna include The Trial here. This is really more, I don't know, surreal fiction, but I think it fits in the tone of what is horror, especially compared to some of the horror books I've read. This is a book that is very much the vein of 1984 as far as being in the surreal world where this man is being charged in this surreal society for this crime that never gets really defined, and he can't fight it. He's presumed guilty from the start, and it's this slow realization that he has no power here. There's no way to stop it, and he's trapped in this warped reality of government control and power. And honestly, it's just really unnerving. Like I feel weird putting it on the horror scale higher than others, but actually explicitly trying to be horror. But in terms of evoking the feelings I associate with horror, it actually is just really effective at that. So I'm going to give it put it moderate love and horrifying, honestly. So above the median scale. Wrong Place, Wrong Time. This is technically more thriller than anything. Mystery thriller. I enjoyed this less than I like on the scale of love to hate. It was definitely closer to hate than love. I just found it underwhelming. I just didn't think it was that effective. And as far as like, it definitely doesn't do anything unnerving. I didn't find the mystery, the thriller aspect to be particularly disturbing, which I'm not necessarily trying to be. So I put it very bland and on the lower end of enjoyment, honestly. So yeah. The Possession of Natalie Glasgow by Haley Piper. This is a novella. This one, like, I enjoyed, but I think it's in retrospect probably not as much as I thought I did in my rated this on Goodreads. It's just very much a middle of the road as far as love and hate, and as far as horror, like, it's perfectly fine and effective. So actually, I'm gonna put it right there in the middle. It was an interesting story that I feel like I remember it being slightly different than expectations, but at the same time, it just felt, in retrospect, it feels like just any other possession story. And I'm pretty sure in my review I said there was something about it that stand out, but clearly not enough for it to stick in my mind all these months later. Okay, My Heart is a Chainsaw, and let's go ahead and I get encompassing this. My Heart is a Chainsaw, Don't Feel the Reaper, and in Ancient Old Indian Lake. I can't say that it's like explicitly horrifying, but it's just, there's so much about this series that is trying to do in terms of horror. There is like the unnerving side of it, the disturbingness, which it definitely is affected that. I'm not completely removed from the story. I'm definitely invested in our characters in a way that is just making me feel oftentimes what they feel. But then there's the other layers of just the homages to the horror genre and just the playing with tropes and expectations and just saying so much in the genre. So in that sense, like I want to say it is the best of horror, like honestly. So when I say horrifying and bland, it may not be the scariest thing ever, but it truly is some of the best horror I've ever read, in my opinion, both in the feelings it's evoking, but also in the ideas it's playing with. So I'm gonna do all three up here. Let's see. Horrifying, around 12. Oh shit, it won't let me do that. It won't let me do that. Okay, so my computer disk filled, but it should be fine now. Where was I? What was I saying? Yes, so I put the horror, so the best horror and loving number 1. I'd say number 2 is exceptional love, and number 3 is a little bit less love than the first 2, but still some of the best loved horror books I've ever read. But anyways, moving on now to the Afterlife of Mal Caldera. Is really just fantasy more than anything. I don't really think it's trying to be horror, but it does deal with death. A woman dies, and in her death, she's a ghost dealing with religious trauma and I think her queerness, if I remember correctly, and just some unpacked issues with her family. Like, I enjoyed it in the moment, but in retrospect, it felt in 2 ways. One, it felt unexceptional as far as the story going in storytelling, to be honest. But also in terms of the world didn't feel quite right. It didn't feel quite that believable. Like, it just felt a little bit off and artificial. So in this sense, I guess I would give it close to bland, I guess, as far as horror, with a love of just not that, I mean, it was okay. And it's definitely less than what I ranked it at the time of doing my review. I think sometimes when I read queer books, I get overly sympathetic towards them because I enjoy the queerness. I love seeing the queer representation. Even if the book itself may not be as objectively that great. So it's like my feelings get mixed that way. I'm not saying it's the wrong feelings, just in the moment I feel differently than I do a little bit of distance, I think. Never Whistle at Night. This is amazing horror. My love of it is very mixed. I had a really hard time getting through this because there was a lot of mid stories. So I would say it's very middling as far as quality goes, but horror, I feel like it's some of the best. Like, the stories just really encompass the wide array of feelings that I evoke with horror, from true terror to some just gothicness to unnerving disturbingness and supernatural and human nature. In terms of horror, solidly recommend. But as far as quality, it's just a very mixed bag in my opinion. Then I'm gonna go ahead and let's go ahead and do every Demonata book. Actually, let's just because I have a whole series dedicated to Demonata, which is to say Lord Lost, Beck, Demon Thief, Slaughter, Demon Apocalypse, Blood Beast, and you'll find later on the last two books, whatever. This is a reread for nostalgia, and I still want to do a full review of this. A standalone review where I just reflect on my feelings of this series, but also just my feelings of my reading taste and how my younger reading taste in horror reflects today. And that's a whole narrative unto itself. I will just say the story, like horror, I think Darren Shane, even for like YA, I loved it because it's just a level of matureness that I don't think I see with most YA authors. And maybe there's a reason for that. We can discuss or you can debate what is appropriate for children. But I think the horror is very solid. As far as quality, I have a lot of issues with it. A lot of issues from just objective storytelling, plotting, characterization, to problematic toxic masculinity and sexism, honestly. So I'd give it like I have some nostalgia feel for it, and I still can thoroughly enjoy it, or rather be engaged by it in a positive way. But my feeling is like it's solid horror, but just not great quality. So that's the bottom right of the graph, if you're paying attention. Now on to Ronald Malfi, Small Town Horror. This is an example of great horror, yet again, a story that kind of pulls on things like Peter Straub's A Ghost Story, Stephen King's It, where you have this group of kids with their own trauma as a kid coming back to haunt them as adults. This, like Peter Straub's Ghost Story, follows really despicable people. And I was hoping for something more, I guess, more redeeming about them. I wanted to care about them when I didn't. And I found the story not quite as satisfying as I would have hoped. I'd say overall I actually enjoyed this, and I would put it slightly above Love Than Hate, and probably, I guess, a 9 out of 10, 9 or 10 on the horror scale. That's maybe a 1 and a 9.5. I should just start giving you numbers so you know where we're at here. I don't know how to read more Ronald Malfi. I'll probably give him another try just because I love a good horror story. And he did not disappoint there. He's very good at horror based off that one book. How Democracy Die, I can talk about that book, it's terrifying, but it's not really horror. Hellbound Hearts. Ugh. This is definitely closer to Hate than Love, with some of the horror just not being very effective. At the same time, I think overall there were a lot of stories that did embody the things I love about Hellraiser. I think the horror side is probably the best part about this. It is the fact that this pulls on that horror universe of Hellraiser, Hellbound Hearts, and the Cenobites that works really well for me. When I read Hellbound Hearts, which is, I guess I should say, is a collection of short stories, an anthology themed within the Hellraiser Cenobite universe, angels to some, demons to others. So I'm gonna give this, honestly, probably a -9, with a horror of, so -9 and +10 horrifying. Then go up to The Night Guest. This is a mystery thriller, technically horror, by Icelandic author, translated by Mary Bennett Kroll. I really like this story. It's very good at setting the tone. I feel myself wanting to give this a middling horror, or slightly better than middling horror, even though I think it's very effective what it's trying to be, which is to say unnerving and gothic and ominous. So in that sense, like, it's very good at that, and I think that's very much a valid form of horror. And also, I just really enjoy the story. So I would give it an 8 for love and maybe a 7 for horror. So far, I can see that I'm clearly enjoying more of the horror I pick up than I don't, which is, I guess, good. This is an interesting graphic I'm creating. It's very, very subjective. Stephen King's It. I love Stephen King's It. My love of it decreases with time, but it's one of those books that I go to reread when I need something comforting or easy to fall back on. So I'll give this a solid, say, 9 for love. And horror of honestly some of the best horror. Like, I still think he's so fucking good at horror, especially in this book. So I'm gonna give it as high as I think the Indian Lake trilogy. Peter Cline's 14, which is in a Lovecraftian horror universe. Overall, I really like this. Let's say probably a 6 or a 7 love, with horror that is solidly Lovecraftian, really effective. It leans at least some into urban fantasy more than just overt horror. So in that sense, I'd probably give it maybe a 5. In the horror, what did I say? Was it 6.5? Yeah, that's so 5 and 6.5. So we're overlapping with one of those books. I'm not sure which one that might be. Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Morton. We'll really get into stories that I've read. I keep meaning to review and I haven't. I loved this. Not the best thing I've ever read, but I was very happy by her reading her work finally. I heard a lot of great things about her, another trans author. I'd say the horror is some of the best. I'd say probably 9 or 10 horror. It's monster horror embedded into religious trauma and these kids who go to a camp to what's it called when they're trying to make you not gay. Don't ask me why I'm forgetting this moment. But the story is not even just centered solely in that. That is a big part of it, but then there's a second part. I think overall my love for this is a bit to do with the pacing, or either the portioning of the part at the camp versus the post camp, or would have liked a bit more time in the post events than we got, where it felt almost like an epilogue, or didn't quite know if it wanted to be an epilogue when it really wasn't, because it was just a big part of the story. So I'd say overall, we'll say 7 love and an 8 horror. It seems like a fair thing to do. Again, a lot of subjectiveness here. I would take these as a general, guide to my overall feelings, and I think anything in the positive love and hate is a solid recommendation from me. The Reaching Hour by Anne Rice. Oh God, I wanted something easy to read. I'm trying to read more backlist books. I keep rereading books like it, and I was like, I should just try to pick up something that's by an author that I found really easy and easy to enjoy, and just try those instead of just the same books over and over. I hated so much about this. I found the ending surprising, but not necessarily in a good way. Just I didn't like the pace. I didn't like how the story was told. I didn't like the fixation on certain parts of history. I would have trimmed this 500 or 600 page book significantly to make it more streamlined, more effective, and just a more enjoyable read. And I just could not get into this. And I had other issues I feel like I had with it. I don't remember. That's in my written review on Goodreads. So I give this a solid -10 in the love, with a horror that it is supposed to be horror, but it's definitely much more urban fantasy. I give it -8 horror and -10 in terms of love. I think it's one of the worst horror books I've read this year. I did not say that, but yeah, that fit. I gave it a 2. Eric LaRocca, The Skin Was Once Mine. I loved this collection. It was phenomenal. The horror was phenomenal in terms of human horror, and just because there's the object horrorness, and then there's just the human, and it might be supernatural, I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. It's all phenomenal. I think I put this up there with Angel of Indian Lake in terms of love and also horror. I'm so excited to read more of their work. Another trans author, non-binary. So I'd give this probably a 12 love and a 12 horror. It's so perfect at what I want. It's unnerving, it's disturbing, it deals with family trauma. It's so much. I just get so excited about shit like that. Don't ask me why, I just do. We have The Worm and His Kings by Hailey Piper. Clearly I'm in my age of Hailey Piper. I really like this. I like this more than The Haunting of Natalie whatever. And I found the horror better too. This Lovecraftian, sort of cosmic horror almost, but not quite as effective for me. But still, I like this. I'll probably give it a solid 6 or 7 in the love, maybe 5. A 5 love with a horror of 2. The Imago Sequence by Lord Byron. I don't know. Twice now I've read Lord Byron and I've been underwhelmed. I love his writing style. I think he does a really good job of encompassing what I can associate with horror and that feeling I want with horror. But this collection of short stories centered around masculinity. I don't know, I just didn't deal with masculinity the way that I wanted. I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be uplifting masculinity or the toxic sides of it, but it's also not critiquing it in the way that I particularly want. I think it's more just looking at characters who are flawed because of their masculinity, or they're flawed masculine people that also center certain stories that I'm just not as much interested in. A lot of like crime or detective stories that just aren't things I was interested in. Even if like the Lovecraftian paranormal horror that we're getting here is definitely in the vein of what I want. So I would give this a -4 in the love to hate scale, with a horror of maybe a 6. A -4 mistake, that seems fair. Shirley Jackson hangs a man. Jackson, yet again, with the feels. This is a disturbing, ominous story that isn't strictly horror, I should say, but it is very much looking at just this family and this young girl trying to start at college and the expectations she has, I think, in society, if I'm remembering this correctly, and it was just very unnerving. I think if I had to search it with something, it would be sort of like a book that had to do with these teenage girls who were cheerleaders and assholes to each other. This had the same vein in dealing with those sorts of themes in society, but more in the early 50s, we're dealing with the time period that Shirley Jackson lived in. I don't know if I explained that very well. So I'd give it probably a 1 or a 2. Yeah, I think a 2 is a fair for enjoyment. In horror, I'd give it maybe -1, just because it isn't really trying to be horror, but I think it just does a really good job of creating this tension and this uncomfortableness with just regular society. Agatha Christie, And Then There Were None. I did really like this. Would it say it's the best thing I've ever read? So I think it's a solid 8 in the love scale, with the horror being more mystery thriller. I think it's closer to middling horror than it knows how to set the tone in a way that's just really effective. So I'd give it probably a -2 in the horroring and a 9 for the love scale. Keep in mind, these numbers I'm giving you are not necessarily out of 10. They're just the random numbers that happen to be on the scale that I copied offline. The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. This was a spur-of-the-moment decision of a story I think I bought when it was on sale on Audible. I enjoyed this. It kind of reminded me of A Christmas Carol, but it's like A Christmas Carol for Halloween. Just looking at Halloween history in a way that is very much middle grade focused, but also kind of enjoyable, following this group of kids who are out Halloween trick-or-treating and then find out their friend who didn't come seems to be sort of pulled away by this dark entity of some sort. And they end up basically traveling through time to try and save him. And it's a cute story that really embodies a lot of feelings of Halloween. I would say my love of it was very middling, so maybe about a 0 for love. I liked it, but didn't love it at all. So I'd give it a 0 on the love-hate scale, with horror being a -9, just because it definitely works well for Halloween. Horror, that's maybe a little unfair when it comes to horroring, but Lost Futures by Lisa Tuttle. We're getting now on the last books that I've read in this year for horror. I don't know if I misrepresented this book on my Goodreads. I could have sworn this was horror. That cover definitely gives horror, but this didn't feel like horror. It looked at this woman who is dealing with problems with identity, and particularly this feeling that she is experiencing or seeing glimpses of other realities, of her multiverses, of where she made different choices, where her life was different, when her brother was alive and she was married, in her dreams. And there's a lot about this that I actually really enjoyed. It reminded me, I guess, of the dream aspect of Multiverse of Madness, which is, say, Doctor Strange 2. And also a little bit of, was it Matt, what's his name's book about that girl who is seeing alternate versions of her life as she's on death's doorbed or death's door or something. I enjoyed that one more, although I think this one feels less formulaic. The one I'm referring to, Matt, what's his name, felt very much like it was very much just about the premise, while this definitely is more interested in character, because the sci-fi aspect of this is much less overt, with 60% of the book going by with it being very vague allusions to it before we get really deep into it. And while there were senses of it that could be uncomfortable, I never felt like it was trying to be horrific or terrifying or unnerving in a sense. Like I was expecting something that just really dug deeper into the horror that could exist within the multiverse. I would say maybe a 2 on the love scale. So I liked it. And the horror, again, I'd probably a -11. So yeah, it was a backlist book that I came across that I decided to give a shot to. Nowhere at Home by John Fram. It's the second book I read by him, the second book. I actually really loved this. This is a sort of a murder mystery in the same vein as Agatha Christie, but dealing with supernatural entities and religious trauma and wealth inequality, and I absolutely loved it. It was a lot of fun, I think the biggest critique I had was the conclusion felt a bit rushed, which also meant that certain characters that we ended up getting insights into did not get the level of depth that I would like to have seen. Overall, I honestly really love this. Probably a solid 10, with horror being maybe a bit more on the mystery side, but I'd give it a solid 4 or 5 in the horror. So I'll go right overlapping this other one that's around 4 or 5. And then craft stories I wrote for the Devil. This one was really, unfortunately, very underwhelming. I liked the start of it, but I just found it disorienting. I couldn't tell whether or not we were following the same character, or even when we shifted characters. I was doing audiobooks, and maybe there was a problem with the editing of the audiobook, not clearly distinguishing when we were on a new story. But it just wasn't clear to me where one story and another one began. Part of that is probably to do with the formatting of the book and of the audiobook, but also just the fact that there's a lack of clarity in the stories themselves. And I guess also probably a bit of lack of closure to really give that distinctive difference. I feel like it is definitely more in just the, kind of like the Halloween tree, leaning more in common, not things, but just common entities that exist. Letting that be a present, not necessarily delving too deeply into the horror sides. Maybe -6 in terms of horror, with an enjoyment of -9, honestly. And then I'm also reading and almost finished with Model Home by Wilbur Sutherland. It's the last one to discuss. And another one like John Fram's. I am loving this one. I'm so excited, so glad that I chose to read this. I ended up buying on Audible, pre-ordering on Audible actually before it came out, Wilbur Sutherland's newest book. Their last book was also horror, and I liked it but didn't love it. This one just works for me in all the ways that matter to me. It deals with religious trauma, family trauma, a haunted house that is there in the background and could even arguably be representing a deeper psychological issues in the family. But the fact that there's just a lot of overlap there that I love. And in fact, this story reminds me even a bit of, is it The Dispossessed or something? Some movie with Glenn Close and Monique and others on Netflix, a new horror story, which is based off a true story, a family that kids acting out because their house was haunted. The difference, like that story I actually didn't like a lot, partly because I felt like it was definitely trying to rewrite history. To say these kids weren't being abused, it was the house doing it. And this one is similar to this. We have this house that seems to be causing issues with family abuse. I think it does a better job of expressing and analyzing the complexities of, I guess, abuse, emotional abuse, especially when it comes to parenting, and the multifaceted way in which a parent can be abusive but also loving and well-intending, while also just dissecting some of the background of things that can impact a person's experience. Well, the house was perhaps representing something bigger than that, and also dealing with just things of gender and sexuality. That just all resonates with me on such a strong level. So this book, absolutely loving it. The horror, I think maybe is the only thing that it's not quite as extreme and say as Angel Indian Lake, and this is I don't think it's trying to be. Although some of the horror, like I think the scariest ones probably do lean on the human side as it deals with sexuality, gender, and race, and the experience of existing in that identity. So I'd give it probably an 8 for that, and definitely a 12, maybe even a 13 for Love. I'm not done with it yet, so I don't want to say 13 yet, but I'd say it's a solid high up, probably going to be 4.5 to 5 stars at least, with an 8 in the horror ring. So that is that. Those were all the horror books I've read in the last year since I've last filmed this, since last Halloween. I'm really glad I did this. I really hope we get a chance to edit it today before Halloween is over, because I still have to do work actually. But with all of that said, if you made it to the end, I appreciate you. Let me know what you thought about this approach of, visualizing on a love, hate, and horror scale. I think I prefer this to the tier ranking, even if I think it's not quite as visually easy to discern. Perhaps I could stand to be a bit more critical of some of the books I read, because I definitely have a bias here. But I think that also just reflects a year of good reading in terms of horror. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I'll be back next month in the same way that I did this for Halloween. I definitely want to do a nonfiction recommendation video for next month before I start traveling at the beginning of November. So I will see you all again soon, probably. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.